And it's because we're made, again, for that reciprocal communion of persons, body and soul. And if we're missing that piece of it, if it's only a physical interaction or a physical union of persons, it's just not going to be enough.
Welcome to the Be Filled podcast. Together, we will explore the deepest desires of the human heart and how our Creator wants to fulfill your every longing. Join us as we explore the beautiful teaching of St. Pope John Paul II on the theology of the body. We are so excited you're here on the journey with us. Open your heart to be filled.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Be Filled podcast. My name is Rochelle Parker, and I'm here today with my lovely friends, Katie Davis, Patty Strauss, and Sister Cecilia Ann. I'm so glad that we're all here this episode as we just continue our journey through St. Pope John Paul II's teaching on the theology of the body. Last episode, we began looking at John Paul II's study on the man of concupiscence and how he took the place of the man of original innocence at the fall. And we talked about how at that moment, man and woman experienced shame for the first time. And this shame led to feelings of fear and insecurity where they had been in such a place of peace and joy. They really lost their sense of self and their place in creation. And we started to talk a little bit about the new meaning of nakedness with this shame that they're experiencing. And you might remember in previous episodes, we talked about how the first man and woman received that gift of life and love from their Creator, and they just had such openness with their Creator. And because of that openness with their Creator, then when they saw each other, they were able to really welcome each other and to receive one another. And they also could see each other fully, like body and soul, when they looked at each other, and they understood the meaning of their bodies and the meaning of being male and female. So if you want to go back and review that, it might be helpful as we move forward today. I went back and I listened to Original Nakedness, the spousal meaning of the body, and also the meaning of original innocence. And I found that to be really helpful. And we'll refer to some of that this episode as well. But today we're going to look at how that new sense of shame and the subsequent covering of their bodies, especially the parts that made them male and female, how that impacted the communion of persons between the man and the woman. So that is audiences 29 through 31.1 in the text. So I'm first going to just summarize the very beginning of audience 29, 29.1 to 29.3. And John Paul II says that the covering of their bodies in response to shame demonstrates that the original power of communicating themselves to each other had been shattered. And he says at that moment, man and woman were no longer free from suspicion when they saw each other. So last episode, we talked about how doubt was cast on God's love for them. So also doubt was then cast on each other. And they could no longer see each other in the same way with such confidence and just being sure, right, of who they are. So John Paul II writes that, of course, we continue to communicate to each other through our bodies, but he says what disappeared was the simple and direct self-communion connected with the original experience of reciprocal nakedness. So before this happened, they had complete trust, right, in one another, and they just very easily could welcome each other. And now they're finding it really difficult to do. Before they understood that their bodies express that communion of persons. Again, like we talked about in other episodes, like a sacrament, their body was this visible sign of this invisible reality of communion between them, of the gift of self. And so they lost when they lost that sense of who they are, being in God's image, they lost this natural understanding of the sacramental meaning of their bodies. So now John Paul II says that rather than seeing each other as a gift and wanting to give themselves to each other, they see, he says, the mutual opposition of persons. And so now they're just kind of seeing the differences between them, and it becomes an obstacle for them in their shame. So, ladies, I'm just really looking forward to hearing your thoughts about this particular section. So, Patty, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I was reflecting on this first section that I had just attended a family wedding, and there was a deacon who really helped me understand this. The text stated that Genesis 3:7 speaks to the loss of the original certainty that through its masculinity and femininity, the human body is precisely the substratum of the communion of person. And so a substratum that serves to realize the communion of persons, and in a very real way, it serves to complete the image of God in the visible world. A substratum, when I looked it up, is really a basis for something. So as Rochelle said, the body is a visible sign of the invisible reality. So there was a loss of the sense of who they were, made in the image of God. So at that wedding, this deacon pointed out that in marriage, that 1 + 1 = 1. And he said that a man plus woman plus God equals 1. And then he emphasized that this is a statement of the Trinity, which is made in the image and likeness of God. He was really working to grasp the language of John Paul II, and this deacon was giving me a simple statement that helped me to really understand it more strongly. Again, thinking of 1 + 1 + 1 = 1, it's that sexual shame attests to the loss of the original certainty that through its masculinity and femininity, the human body is precisely the substratum or the basis of the communion of persons. So the man plus the woman expresses that communion, and then it serves to realize that in that it completes the image of God in the visible world, because man plus woman plus God is 1. So we can imitate the union of one God, 3 divine persons in a marriage where we are the product of this union. We are the product of this union. We are the image of God in ourselves. God is the one that ordained that 2 become 1 when they are married, and 9 months later, they can actually name the 3rd. So it was very powerful to reflect on what the deacon said at this wedding. And now, through sin, the couple can not see that each other is being one, but is being sexually different. So it's important that we're really intentional in reflecting on this, and I think that helps me strive for more when I see the purpose and the intent.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. Sister?
Well, I guess when I was reading over this, I kind of thought, what came to my mind was the whole battle of the sexes, After the fall, now we are focusing on the differences. And I don't know if you're very familiar with Samuel Clemens, who we know as Mark Twain. And when I teach the students in middle school, we often read Tom Sawyer. And in there it has, Tom Sawyer is trying to he's being punished, and he has to whitewash his fence, okay? And so he's trying to get other kids to help him do his work. And so he's acting like it's a lot of fun. And so he has a definition in there about work is anything you have to do. Play is what you get to choose to do. And I thought when we read this section, it made me think, love, the communion of persons, was that freely giving of the gift of oneself to another. But after the original sin and shame comes and everything, now it's work, Children will be brought forth in pain, and there's a suspicion, okay? So what was before freely given, now there's that fear that it can be taken away, So that natural reciprocal gift of self is no longer there. So that's kind of where my thoughts were.
Yeah, makes sense. That's good. I'm going to read to Mark Twain now. I think, when I was, the quote that stuck out to me the most was on page 248 of the text, and it said, since after original sin, man had lost the sense, so to speak, of the image of God in himself, that loss manifested itself by shame. And I was trying to think about, I have this continual flower analogy that will eventually be a painting hanging in my home or a children's book, according to Patty. But, I was thinking about this picture of this flower, and, the roots are God because he created us, but it shoots up a stem that will eventually flower. But before, what happens is it has to produce leaves. And I was in my garden where I do all of my deep thinking, and I all of a sudden was just thinking like, oh my goodness, the leaves are shame. Like, they are required by the flower before it blooms to get the nutrients, photosynthesis, if you're going back to your science class. And so the leaves have to be there, just as historical man has to have the shame, the leaves. We kind of talked about the goodness of the good parts of shame last time, and where the leaves get their nutrients, where photosynthesis happens, it has to receive from the sun. Come on. And so, so this will all eventually come together, but I'm just like piece by piece, like really thinking about like the loss is manifested itself by shame. So there is a loss, but there's also that goodness. And the commentary on page 194 kind of goes through and further explains like, this is the tragedy of concupiscence. It exchanges a self-seeking gratification for the sincere gift of self, and it uses the other as an object made for his or her own sake. And now we call that normal. And it is by some means normal because we pay for things. And, even before money, we were bartering. And so there is kind of that exchange. And so I think what's confusing to us most is like where I'm being used versus where it's an even exchange, or where you're noticing me and I appreciate it versus, ooh, you just used me. And I think that is, I always think of Christopher West's, he always says the opposite of love is not hate, it's use. And we all feel that, right? You can feel when you're being used, and you can feel that shift. And so while the leaves are necessary, they can also get eaten up by bugs and get holes in it and then unable to receive the sun. And we could go on for hours with the analogy, but really just something to ponder.
Yeah, that is so good. I can't wait to see that painting.
I know.
And
it's going to be a beaut.
Make it available to our podcast listeners. Wouldn't that be nice?
Yes.
Oh man, it's so great. And I can say I knew you when, like before you were famous. Painting. Okay. So I've shared before my background in psychology. So like I am fascinated by the psychology of all this. And like, so I might talk a little bit about that throughout, just like what's going on, like in their thinking, their thoughts and their feelings that's making them behave in this way. And I feel like St. Pope John Paul II has that a little bit in there too. But I was just thinking about like, before they had this shame, they communicated with their nakedness, like, I am giving myself to you freely. Right? Like I'm holding nothing back. We talked about that before with original nakedness, that it wasn't just about not wearing clothes. It was about that vulnerability, right? And so before they were communicating that, but now they cover themselves, which is communicating that, I'm withholding from you. Like I'm not giving myself freely to you. I'm protecting myself. And I was thinking, what's under that? And he's going to go even deeper into all of this, but I really feel like when you're afraid, and I think the shame made them afraid that they would not be received, right? They would not be loved as they were in their weakness. And so when you feel that way, you just naturally hold back and you don't want to give of yourself. And so I don't know, I think it's so beneficial to really sit with that, and kind of ask ourselves, like, where am I afraid and where am I holding back, and sometimes it's good, like, because there
protection.
sometimes it's good to hold back and to not be vulnerable with everyone, right? But especially, in marriage and in that spousal union, just really looking at that, like, where am I afraid to really give freely of myself? So those were just kind of some of my little introductory thoughts, but thank you so much for all of your thoughts. That was so beautiful. And Patty, I'm so grateful for that deacon and how he brought that to life for you, and that you were able to share that with us too. That's really powerful. It's so lovely when our deacons and priests really are grasping that and sharing it with others, So the next section we're going to talk about, we're going to go even deeper into this shame. And we're also going to talk about the meaning of insatiability of the union. And so this is audiences 29.4 through 30.6. So I thought this was super powerful. John Paul II said that shame is the symptom of man's detachment from love in which he participated in the mystery of creation. I feel like we could even just stop after love. Shame is the symptom of man's detachment from love. Wow, we could all just kind of sit for a minute with that. But to discover the deeper meaning of this shame, John Paul II is going to go to Scripture again. He's going to analyze Genesis chapter 3, verse 16, which he says demonstrates the impact that this shame has on the relationship between man and woman. And so I'm just going to read that, and we can dig into that a bit. It says, "To the woman, he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." So John Paul II really focuses in on those last two lines. Yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. And he says that this is a new dynamic between the man and the woman that really indicates a lack of unity or communion to which they were originally called. They were made to experience mutual happiness through being that reciprocal gift to one another. And he says, John Paul II says, they are the same community of persons, but now something different. They are no longer only called to union and unity, but are also threatened by the insatiability of that union and unity, which does not cease to attract man and woman precisely because they are persons called from eternity to exist in communion. So he's saying they're afraid, but yet they're drawn to it, right? Yeah. It's that push-pull thing we've talked about before in other episodes. Like they still have that desire for union they're made for, but also this awareness that something is just not quite right. So what does the word insatiable mean? It means unable to be satisfied, right? So a desire that's unable to be satisfied. So why would their union now not be satisfying? And it's because we're made, again, for that reciprocal communion of persons, body and soul. And if we're missing that piece of it, if it's only a physical interaction or a physical union of persons, it's just not going to be enough. It's not going to completely satisfy because it's made to be both a spiritual, emotional experience as well as a physical experience. So, ladies, what stuck out to you in this section? Sister, would you like to go first?
Sure. As you just mentioned, man and woman were created to be images of God in this perfect communion. Well, after the sin and shame came in, that is no longer present, And so, like I said, there's push and pull. There's this no longer truly being able to trust one another. And yet, like I said, we're being drawn. We want that union, that communion. And it beckons back to St. Augustine, who says, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. And I think that's an expression of we're longing for something that no longer can be filled, like you said, just bodily. We need to have that communion with God and with one another, but it's no longer perfect, because after the fall, we whether we intentionally want to or not, we see the obstacles. We see our differences. Instead of seeing them as complementary, we see them as obstacles, as challenges and so forth. So that's kind of where I rested, was the whole idea that God is forever drawing us to himself. But we know that we no longer can find that true communion just with our physical beings here on earth, that it is truly meant to be that perfect union with God in heaven.
Right.
So that's kind of what I thought.
Sister, my reflections were so akin to yours, and I kind of went back to my original reflection with what the deacon had said. That you have man and woman, but then there's God there too. And so I also took that we could really reflect on how shame is the symptom of man's detachment from love, in which he participated in the mystery of creation. So God is love. And so when we detach from God, who is love, then actually we become somewhat deformed, which is exactly what you're saying. And so when we detach from the vine, we experience that shame, but then the opposite is true. And I really like to kind of go there. So like the opposite is true, and our purpose and our time on earth is to draw closer to the Lord, who's the vine. And so the more we grow in the love of God for his sake, then the more we don't just do God's will, we're actually, the closer we become to God, the more we are living in God's will. And so that break between man and woman, by drawing closer to our Lord, then we become more Christ-like, more God-like. And then so we're able to somehow, there is that frustration between man and woman, but then as we're spending time in prayer, we can just see that in our lives as we get older. And then we have that to talk about to our children, like, okay, so I get your struggle. And I go back to that in our conversations with my children. I have 3 daughters and 4 sons, and the conversations of the difference between the male and the female and the frustrations that happen with that. But that we just see it every day, that as we draw closer to our Lord in prayer and we spend time, we have a little more patience, we have a little deeper understanding, we get the nuance of communication a little bit better. So I really enjoyed thinking about that there is that break, but that God's given us a pathway, and it's, actually frustrating and delightful at the same time.
That's so true. Frustrating and delightful. That's perfect.
It's the push-pull.
Yeah, the push-pull.
That's so good. Awesome.
So I really got into the commentary on this one, and I was trying, Christopher doesn't follow the audiences exactly, but in his commentary, but there is a section on 194, and it's called Sin's Effect on Women. And it is just amazing. Like, if you do not have a commentary, like, find one, and just, it's a page, 2 pages. And it was really all focusing on receptivity. And I mentioned this a bit last episode of like Eve grasping for the apple, and then you, sister, brought in the amazing imagery of like, well, he never said he wasn't going to give the apple. He just said, not now. So it's really just that sin of disobedience. There's nothing wrong with eating the apple. That's the sin. And I just really started thinking about that, and thinking about, like, the commentary goes on to say that because of sin, woman is now experiencing a particular reduction with man. And woman has a special gift. And her gift is that she embodies receptivity in relation to God and the man. And that receptivity is fit for new life. Like, do we realize what God is trying to show us here? But unfortunately, after the fall, she's no longer going to experience it as a gift. In fact, we often refer it as women as a curse. And we have to really be thinking about how we talk about that every month, or even with children in general, or our fertility. I now just am so sensitive every time I hear that, and thinking of it as a burden or something that we have to deal with. And the commentary goes on in this gray box. On page 195, it talks about women's receptivity in relationship to God, calling it our special genius. And it was just so sweet, what it said. And it said, when we reject our posture of receptivity as feminine bride in favor of being our own masculine lords, we want to be like God, but without God. And that just wrecked me. And I just know that, we know when there's a break, the communion of persons all of a sudden isn't the perfect image of God. And later on, what does God do? He shows us another example of perfect receptivity through the new Eve. And we have so much angst sometimes about Mary and should we be praying to Mary or not? And the way I see it is Mary redeemed everything that Eve grasped for. She sat and she received perfectly into her womb a communion of persons that produced life.
Oh my goodness.
And so it's almost like God was like, okay, the whole communion of persons things at the beginning didn't exactly work out. Let me show you another way to receive me. And as I was also crying, as I was praying through this, a prayer from St. Elizabeth of the Trinity came to me, and I just thought that I would just share this excerpt to kind of put a bow on all of it. And receive is actually my word of the year. And so I've been thinking about receptivity all year round, and I have this dear friend who painted these precious open hands that I can meditate and pray with, and on the back of it, she wrote this quote from St. Elizabeth of the Trinity, and it's from This Present Paradise, which is an amazing book by Claire Dwyer, but she just really, this is right before she's dying. She died at 26 years old. She's writing to her Mother Superior who has been caring for her. And now, as she is dying and suffering and in the most pain, she wants to comfort her Mother Superior and thank her for taking care of her on her deathbed. It's the perfect gift exchange. And this is what she writes to her Mother Superior. She says, "Let yourself be vulnerable. Let your walls down, your carefully constructed fortresses breached, your fiercely guarded heart laid bare. Let your wounds be touched, your fears revealed, your deepest desires, damaged dreams, and most daring hopes unveiled before the bridegroom who has the power to redeem, restore, and resurrect them. Drop your independence and the idea which you clutch so tightly that you can do anything to protect and save yourself, and let him love you." Beautiful.
Amen.
Yeah, I feel like I kind of spoiled the end of theology of the body because that's where we're going, people. And she talks about the universal vocation of all of us is just to love. And the only way we can love is to receive, to have that receptivity. And she says our primary vocation is to be loved by God. What a radically freeing idea that is. Yeah. That all we have to do is simply allow God to love us, and we've done the most important work of our lives. Really? Sign me up.
Right? Sign me up. Oh, wow. Okay, now I'm wrecked too, but in a really good way. So, oh my goodness, that was so beautiful. And that really dovetailed too with what I was thinking about too, about like this whole new dynamic between man and woman, and how, sometimes we want to blame one or the other, but it's not a man problem. It's not a woman problem. It's an us problem. And it's a vision problem, right? And I was just thinking, like, in our episode about original unity, we talked about unity is defined in two different ways. First of all, that we are brother and sister, right? In our humanity. And then, of course, the one flesh union. But if we lose sight of that brother and sister part, right, that's when we really get caught up in the anger and the fear and put those walls up like you're talking about. And I was thinking, what is the solution? And similar to you, I was thinking, like, one, you have to have that connection with God, that vulnerability with God, and let that union with Him be restored, right? To heal those wounds. And then in all relationships, but especially in marriage, to intentionally be vulnerable and expose your weakness to each other, even when you don't want to, especially when you don't want to,
right?
Because that is, I think, the key to our eyes being opened again and allowing that grace to step back into that flow of grace with God, and then to welcome and receive each other. And I can only say that, I don't want to get into a lot of personal things about my marriage, but I do feel like this is an area that my husband and I are growing in, how to just open ourselves more to each other. And it is such a gift, but it's scary, right? Right. It's so scary because you think, what if he sees this and is disappointed in me or won't love me here? But I have yet to see that actually happen. If anything, when we do that, we love each other more, right. And we accept and understand each other more. So I'm just so grateful for that prayer. And we will definitely make that prayer available in the show notes, because I really want to sit with that some more.
You need it. You need
sure.
a good hour.
Oh, 100%. A good holy hour
a day.
Adoration or something would be good. So thank you. That was such a gift. Oh my goodness. Okay, so we have one more section to go through, and it's on where does the insatiability of the union come from? And some of this we've kind of touched on already, but it's audience 31.1 to 31.4. And John Paul II kind of has a couple of side notes I thought that were interesting. One is he wants us to know that the source of shame is not the body itself or even our sexuality, but it goes back to the deepest transformations suffered by the human spirit, right? So sometimes we want to blame the body, or like I said, blame the man or blame the woman, but no, it's something very deep that has happened in all of us. And then he gives us a little bit of hope and talks about how shame actually can be really helpful if it gives us an awareness that leads to protection of the spousal meaning of the body. And we've talked a little bit about that before, how when we pay attention to those feelings that come up, we can recognize them. And then this is a really cool thing that he says. He says that shame can provide weapons ahead of time against the consequences of the threefold component of concupiscence. How cool is that, right? Yeah. That actually what's meant to sort of tear us down by our enemy actually can help us to become more holy if we bring it to prayer and if we recognize it. So I just think that is really cool. And as we learn and grow in what is authentic love and what are our relationships meant to be, then we're able to more clearly recognize the thoughts and feelings that come up that don't match, right? So it's pretty awesome. And we already talked about how we now have this conflict of wanting that communion, but then our concupiscence of the flesh tends to direct our desires more to the appeasement of the body, sometimes at the cost of authentic and full communion of persons. He gets a little bit into what's going on with the man that leads him to want to dominate the woman. And I really think that for both man and woman, it's about that shame and that fear and just reactions to it, right? So he says that before, this moment, man and woman lived in that relationship of unity and reciprocal gift. But as soon as the man begins to dominate the woman, he says the communion of persons is replaced by a different mutual relationship, namely by a relationship of possession of the other as an object of his own desire. And so he also acknowledges women, we have our part too. He says that sometimes we attempt to arouse that desire to possess in man. And, I'm sure that we can speak to that as women a little bit too, kind of what our reactions are. But there's a lot to process in this little bit. So what were your reflections on this section? Katie, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, I had to visualize a tomato plant when you were talking. About shame, because again, going back to the leaf analogy, have you ever trimmed all the leaves on your tomato plants?
I can't grow anything.
So if you have a big giant tomato plant and your leaves start to yellow, your instinct is, I'm going to just cut all the leaves off And what happens is the fruit then is exposed too harshly to the elements and to the sun, and it burns the fruit.
Yeah.
So we have to have those leaves covering up the fruit sometimes.
I love that. Yeah.
in order not to get burned. I mean, the analogies are endless, but two messages here I have for my kids when I think about this, and this is something I think I was like, I say for my kids, but I also need to remind myself. One, our bodies are not bad, and there's a footnote in the commentary on 194, and it talks about, and I think, like, sometimes we think we're holy if we disassociate from our body. And so, they tell this story about this woman with tired skin, and she says, when I go to see my Lord, my spirit's going to be free at last, and I can shed this old tired skin. And, tragically, it says that what stems from this, it's good-hearted, it looks virtuous, but she believes that it says she believed that by focusing attention on the body, she was stuck in the world and stuck on the things of the earth, whereas she had her mind set on heavenly things. Well, actually, by virtue of Christ's incarnation and ascension, the body is the heavenly thing, right? Because Christ's body did rise. So, one, our bodies are not bad. Two, it matters very much what we do to our bodies and with our bodies. And so we cannot disassociate from our bodies. We have to try and work to understand why God made our bodies just the way they are. Even these little gray hairs that start to show up here. I'm starting to embrace them because they remind me that I will not be here forever on earth. And so just looking at our bodies and looking at everything we do with our bodies and how important it is, I think that's just something we can't remind ourselves and our kids enough.
Yeah, that's so good.
Yeah. So I kind of, on the heels of that, when I was reading this section and the section right before, there was just a lot of looking at how we aren't necessarily connecting very well with the other person, and a lot of it is maybe because of the body situation. And I felt like it was really very heavy, and because as we're reading John Paul II, right, we're going through Genesis with a very, very fine-tooth comb, and we see that how much our Lord loves us, and we're looking incrementally of, in all the nuances of how great God wanted it for us, but yet how we're struggling and messing with that. And so I was just kind of needing some hope, and I really loved how John Paul said, that with shame, we do have that intentionality. We kind of want to protect that, and we kind of want to try to protect our understanding of the communion and union of persons in the greatest way. But I get really concerned about our society as a whole, and so I really like to reflect on your tomato plant, that we have to almost protect it. And I think we have to keep talking about this, and I think we have to keep encouraging our kids, because we see so much. Like one of the theologians that I listened to, he said that, over 90% of couples are living together before they're married. And so I just get that sense of there's not a protection, that tendency towards getting into more of a used situation because they haven't entered into the sacramental union where God is so present. And so instead of living a natural life, they're missing out on living a supernatural life, because it's sacramental in that a sacrament is that Christ gives us grace, which is the life of God within us. And so it hurts to look at our world and to recognize we're studying the incremental beauty and looking at shame and not use and loving purely, and the closer we get to God. But there's just this sense that our world needs this message so much. So, and to look at shame in a more positive way, I always have to kind of go to the hope, and to just turn to our Lord when we, praying these prayers where, we're opening ourselves and trusting in God because it's bigger than us. So it was a very good section to reflect on. But John Paul II can be kind of difficult.
For sure. I would very much echo with what you said too. I think, again, as we've mentioned before, shame has its place, and God allows it to bring us closer to Him, to recognize, hey, we've stepped off, the right path, and it's His attempt to help us get back where we need to be. In Romans 7:19, we read the quote of St. Paul saying, I do not do the good I want, but I do the evil I do not want. And I think that's kind of the story of all of our lives,
Yes.
We have this call, this urge to something, but it's slightly deformed. Because of original sin, our desires are not pure like they should be. We have this sense of, self-preservation at the expense of another. We have a desire for fulfillment, but so often at, maybe having to step on somebody else's toes. So the original root maybe is not bad. We do want to persevere. We do want to have a union and so forth. But because of that deformity due to sin, our desires so often are at that push and pull against one another, those with whom we live, who are supposed to be part of that communion of persons, but we make it kind of more of a battle, putting ourselves before others instead of trying to truly be united with them. So I think it's a story that we will, as we know, St. Paul reminds us, we will have into our dying day. But hopefully every little step will bring us to that closer union here on earth so that we can enjoy that union with God in heaven.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, so beautiful. I was definitely reflecting on my experience too, and what you just shared, sister, made me think of something that I heard whenever I was in 12-step recovery. I've talked about all of that before, just how I was kind of trying to get that attention a lot. And there was just never enough attention. But one of the phrases people used to say is that we took from others to fill up what was lacking in ourselves. And so that's kind of what you were saying, is that, I'm trying to fill something that is really unfillable outside of God, right? But it also really quickly, and we can end on this, this reminded me of a quote from John Paul II's meditation on givenness, and it's about this idea of taking possession of someone. And it says, the urge to take possession of the other and use him, such a person destroys within himself the capacity to be a gift. He succumbs rather to the temptation of living to possess more and more pleasures, more experiences, more sensations, fewer real values, less creative suffering for good, less readiness to sacrifice self for the good and beauty of humanity, less participation in redemption. And I thought that was really, really powerful, because there's just never going to be enough if it's about possessing, and so we're made for that eternal union, like you were saying, with the Trinity. And so that's really what we're after. There's never going to be enough pleasure this side of heaven to fill those deepest longings of our hearts. So yeah, I just encourage, I'm certainly going to do this and encourage everyone to just take this all to prayer, and just ask the Lord to open your heart to where you might be grasping, to where you might be self-centered in relationships. And yes, Lord, just open our eyes and help us to see and just heal our vision, Lord. But that is all the time that we have. See, there's so much. And next episode, we're going to wrap up this section on the man of concupiscence, and the audience is 31.5 through audience 33. And John Paul II is just going to keep on expanding what we talked about today, and just some really powerful things for us to contemplate. So please know that we're praying for you, and we would love if you would pray for us too. And so until next episode, God bless.
Thank you so much for listening. If you have questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. We can be reached by email at befilledpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on social media. We are on Facebook and Instagram. There you can find additional encouragement in between episodes. Also, be sure to check out our show description for links to resources we discuss in the show, as well as questions for deeper reflection. Until the next episode, God bless.